The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
As trippy as it sounds, it turns out that magic mushrooms might just be, well, magical. That's what researchers and mental health advocates say as access for therapeutic use expands in Canada. Tonight, why the push is on to legalize psilocybin mushrooms for medical use and what they might offer that conventional medicines don't. It's Thursday, March 30th, and that's next on the agenda. Psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms as they're often called, are illegal in Canada. But after decades on the list of illicit substances, researchers here and around the world want a fresh start for this fungus. They say it can deliver life-changing effects for mental illness, palliative care, and more. So, is it time to legalize medical mushrooms? With us on that, in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, Dr. Valerie Masuda, a palliative care physician and associate professor of clinical medicine at the University of British Columbia. She provides psilocybin-assisted therapy. In Vancouver, BC, Mark Hayden, adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health. He was formerly executive director of MAPS Canada. That's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And here in our studio, lawyer Paul Lewin, who focuses on matters related to cannabis and psychedelics and is currently involved in a legal challenge in federal court to fight the status of psilocybin. Paul, good to have you back here in our studio. I know you were on the show many years ago, and to our guests in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us as well. Let me just set up our conversation with this. Last February, Elizabeth May, co-leader of the Green Party, and other MPs joined a delegation of patients and healthcare practitioners to call on the feds to make psilocybin, the psychedelic compound produced by magic mushrooms, more readily available. Here's what she said. We need to do more research, May said, but to get that research done, we need to make access available to patients whose doctors are there to help them with registered therapists who know how to administer psilocybin. This past November, we saw Colorado legalize magic mushrooms, becoming the second American state to do so after Oregon. We have also seen magic mushroom dispensaries pop up in cities across Canada. Okay, Valerie, start us off here. How would you characterize this moment for magic mushrooms and psilocybin-assisted therapy today?
I'm very optimistic at this point. I find that in the past, with Richard Nixon in 1972, basically crushing psychedelic assisted therapy in research as well as in treatment, we're starting to see a very cautious resurgence of research as well as really promising evidence that this is a medication that can be used very safely in the treatment of treatment-resistant depression and anxiety. And with my patient population with existential distress related to their cancer diagnosis. And now we're starting to see the federal government just start to fund the clinical trials to show the promise of these medications in the use of mental health conditions.
Okay, Paul, to you, where are we at right now on this issue?
Well, there's a lot of problems with medical access, but generally where we're at with psilocybin, it's really a revolution in Canadian society. And I think it started about 3 years ago. And I'm just seeing a large percent of the population turning to psychedelics and psilocybin. And so it's kind of the beginning of a revolution if I was to characterize this moment in time.
What do you think prompted the revolution?
You know, I don't know. The war on drugs is increasingly being seen as a failure, but people have turned to other drugs. Research is increasing. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what's changing Canadians' minds.
Mark, do you think the hype can live up to the let me rephrase that. Can the reality live up to the hype that we're hearing about the potential for psilocybins right now?
Well, that's an interesting question because I tend to be cautionary. The research evidence that psilocybin is helpful for many different diagnoses is compounding. We know, or we have very good evidence that it's useful for depression, end-of-life anxiety, and addiction issues. And so that's growing, but I'm also cautionary. I think that we can overemphasize the benefits and not explore some of the concerns, and that can result in overselling, and then it could result in disappointment, and then a backlash. It's interesting for me to compare it to the whole cannabis process, because cannabis was legalized because it was seen as being harmless, and the harms of prohibition were greater than the harms of cannabis itself. But they didn't medicalize it. It was just popular opinion that legalized cannabis. Psychedelics are being legalized as well, slowly, but not through popular opinion. It's being legalized because they're going through stage 1 and through 2 and 3 clinical trials. That changes popular opinion.
Do you have a view as to whether you agree with Paul as to whether we're in the midst of a revolution on this right now?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, psychedelics are back. You know, my wife is a psychiatrist, and I've looked her straight in the eye and said, you know, we are going to change your profession. Psychedelic medicine is going to change psychology, psychiatry, clinical social work, nursing. The evidence for its effectiveness is compounding and compelling.
Well, one of the reasons there's so much excitement right now are because of the number of trials and studies that are happening. And let's, Sheldon, if you would, bring up this graphic and we'll talk about that. In 2016, there was a study conducted at Johns Hopkins University in the States that found that just a single dose of psilocybin offered relief to subjects suffering from depression and anxiety related to life-threatening cancers. And then 6 months after receiving treatment, 78% experienced lower rates of depression and 83% experienced lower rates of anxiety. In 2022, another study showed that 58% of patients with severe depression unrelated to a cancer diagnosis who received 2 doses of psilocybin together with therapy had a substantial and sustained remission in symptoms a year later compared to other patients on a waiting list for this treatment. Okay, Valerie, let me get you back in here because you've guided a number of people through this therapy. First off, how do you do this therapy with them?
So it has to be really clear that the magic mushroom is not the magic bullet. So you can't go out and take some magic mushrooms and then you're cured. So this is in context of a proper therapeutic program. It's much like, you know, a procedure. So it's like a shoulder replacement. You know, you don't just give a patient an artificial shoulder. There's a surgeon that needs to be involved. There's rehabilitation that needs to be involved. And it's similar to this. So a patient needs to be prepared with a therapist and a physician for the administration of this medicine. The medicine is given in a very, we call it a setting of peace and tranquility, of safety, where the patient feels safe and has a safe relational experience with their therapist and the physician. And then after that, they have this integration period. So the psilocybin allows the brain to have a period of what I would say neuroplasticity. So previous thought and behavior patterns that are currently ingrained in the brain, then there's an opportunity for those thought and behavior patterns to kind of be released. And now you have an opportunity to go in and create new thought and behavior patterns that are healthy. So I have had patients who have had psilocybin with the preparation, but were not able to have that integration. And within a month, they have fallen back into their usual thought and behaviors.
What's the success rate, though, that in your experience?
I would say it's about 70 to 80% success rate as long
that's
as the
pretty
patient
good.
is able to continue. So it is very, very, very good. When we look at, you know, the use of pharmaceuticals, which obviously in my patient population don't really help. When a patient has a cancer diagnosis and they're going to die, you know, the only thing that's going to cure that anxiety and distress is a cure of their cancer. So if they're faced with a terminal illness, then they really struggle with that. So seeing patients transform from being a period of hopelessness and purposelessness to then being able to go ahead and accept their diagnosis, accept their dying, and being able to reconnect with their family and friends over those really important months is it's incredible.
Okay, let's get a legal update here. Paul, what is the current legal status of psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms in Canada today?
So psilocybin it's prohibited to possess, to sell, to give, to grow, to export, to import. Essentially, everything to do with psilocybin is prohibited unless it's subject to one of the three narrow means of legal medical access, which are, you've heard Dr. Masuda mention, the Section 56 exemptions.
Section 56 of what?
That's Section 56 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act.
There we go.
In which the government may exempt a person if it's medically necessary. There's a special access program, which has kind of replaced the Section 56 exemptions. And then you could try, hope to catch on with a clinical trial.
How tough is it to get any one of those three options?
Well, they're all problematic. So the government's not really granting 56s anymore. SAPs, there's a lot of problems around the special access program, and probably central to this is the fact that the government is the gatekeeper. It should be the doctor as gatekeeper. So this is a very personal decision that should be between patient and doctor. The doctor is the person who is legally committed to acting in the patient's best interest. The government is not obliged to do that. They may issue an SAP or a 56. They don't have to. They can reject it for reasons unrelated.
And when you say they, the government, are we talking the Ministry of Health?
Minister of Health, yes. And this requires a complex application that the doctor completes for the patient. It involves sending a lot of very private, sensitive, personal information to the government, to the minister and unknown bureaucrats. It involves delays. It involves convincing them that this is really a treatment of last resort, that you've tried every other kind of invasive therapy and nasty pharmaceutical, and this isn't the way it should be. It should be a decision between patient and doctor.
So in your judgment, it's still way too restrictive?
Way too restrictive, and it's just a failed model.
Okay. Mark, let me go to you. For someone in Canada who wants to undergo this type of therapy, maybe they have one of the three options, difficult though they may be, available to them. What sort of legal access do they have available to them right now? What are the chances of getting it?
Well, I'd like to elaborate on the last comments, is that we also have de facto decriminalization. So we have, as you may know, mushroom shops popping up in Vancouver everywhere. So there's a long history of this. The Vancouver Police Department has been very progressive. And when Stephen Harper in the previous era announced an increased draconian nature to the cannabis laws, the Vancouver Police Department publicly stated they would no longer enforce cannabis laws. And then we had cannabis dispensaries popping up everywhere. We have the same process now happening with mushrooms, as the Vancouver Police Department have said they're not going to enforce mushroom laws. And so we have mushroom dispensaries everywhere. Now, there's pros and cons to that. The advantage is it allows people to see a normalized access to a psychedelic drug. The con is that it doesn't fully engage with the therapeutic process. You know, it doesn't really provide mushrooms in the context that Valerie was talking about, of where you control for set and setting, expectation, environment, where you screen people appropriately and provide a skilled experience for people. So there's a pro and con to mushroom stops, but they're actually everywhere in Vancouver.
Well, Paul, can you tell us whether that's the case in Ontario? Do we have dispensaries popping up everywhere, and have the cops in this city and or province basically decided to turn a blind eye to it all?
Well, there's some in urban centers like Toronto and Ottawa and Hamilton. Some have been raided, and people are facing charges. People caught with psilocybin in a context other than a psilocybin store are readily charged, and prosecutors will seek jail. And I agree, Vancouver is sort of its own world, and that's great. But unfortunately, the rest of the country isn't where Vancouver's at. So
we, in your judgment, do not have, quote unquote, reasonable access to it in Ontario right now?
We don't have reasonable access to it, and really, I think the failure of reasonable access is driving the black market.
Okay, there have been, I gather, a number of smaller clinical trials using psilocybin with promising results. Do we know, Valerie, let me go to you on this. Do we know categorically now that this is a safe product to use under a doctor's care?
I think we can categorically say that psilocybin is very safe. There is no lethal dose of psilocybin. It is safer than caffeine. It is safer than nicotine. It's very much safer than alcohol. Of course, if people take a large dose of psilocybin, they are in a situation where they can be very emotionally, physically, or spiritually vulnerable. And so people taking large doses of psilocybin in very unsafe environments can be harmful. So it's more of a psychological or psychiatric harm that they would be exposing themselves to. So it has to be, I think, delivered in a very safe environment. And the people that are in the therapeutic environment with the patient, the physicians and therapists, we have to have professional accountability for those therapists and professionals. And the only way we can do that is through the professional colleges. And so these professional regulators currently are not putting forth guidelines or criteria for treating patients, or even guidelines for physicians and registered clinical counselors to have specific training in psychedelic medicine. So there's no real safety currently for patients accessing on the street.
Mark, are there some people for whom this is not a good option, that it is too dangerous for them to use?
Yes. There are certain screen exclusion criteria, is what you're asking for. Specifically, mania. I think psychedelics are generally destructive for people with mania. There are certain personality disorders that we actually don't know if psychedelics are helpful for, and they can be harmful. So we don't know about youth and children. Psychedelics are generally not seen as being appropriate for youth and children. So appropriate screening is actually really, really important. And I want to echo what Valerie said. It's all about the context of use. So it's about the skill of the therapist. And part of the skill of the therapist is appropriate screening. There are some mental health diagnoses that we don't know whether they're helpful for. Now, curiously enough, there is a belief that I have that I would like to challenge many people in my position. Researchers generally believe that schizophrenia is an exclusion criteria, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But I've dug through all of the historical literature and have decided that it's not as simple as most researchers believe. I think that a very, very low dose of some psychedelics may be helpful for some people with schizophrenia. So there are some new things coming down the pipe, but we need to be very careful, and giving psychedelics to the wrong people will increase harms. And we want to get this right at this point in the drama.
Just for the record, you and I talked before we started about whether or not I could ask you about psilocybin and your own personal use of it. And you said, yes, it's okay, you can ask me. So I'm going to do that now. Because I've never tried it, so I have no clue about this. What was it like?
Well, it is a distinctive experience. I find that one's much more in the moment. I sometimes think about myself. It seems like I have a Rolodex of things I say to people in my life. So I'm going to pull out number 9. And, on psilocybin tends to bring out a much more mindfulness in which I listen more carefully to those who speak to me. And I'm more in the moment, a little less caught up in my ego. And I find there's carryover effects to the next day. And a lot of people microdose, which are very small amounts and which don't make you high. And there's a huge amount of anecdotal evidence that this is actually doing tremendous amount of good.
Ever had an adverse reaction to it?
I have not.
You've not? Okay. And again, forgive my ignorance here. Do you take it in a pill form, or do you inject it, or how do you take it?
My experiences with it have been with the raw mushrooms, the dried mushrooms. But of course, patients getting it under the special access program would be getting synthetic psilocybin.
And that synthetic means what?
Synthetic. So it's been, and pardon my ignorance, but it's been, it's not the natural, and it's not an extract. It's something that's been made in a laboratory, and that's not the best description of it. So
it's better than what I could give you. So okay, we'll take that. We'll take that. Valerie, let me get you back in here. You have said. How does this discussion about medical access to mushrooms factor into the potential decision next year to expand medical assistance in dying to people with mental illnesses? Can you speak to that, please?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I actually was one of the witnesses for the Joint Standing Committee on MAID. For my palliative patients, I'm an assessor for medical assistance in dying, and there are many reasons why people access medical assistance in dying. But existential distress and psychological suffering is one. And when I can see a medication given to the right population of patients have a 70 to 80% effectiveness rate, where people are it's transformative, where people who feel they have no purpose in their life anymore because of a terminal illness, then completely changing and being able to live the rest of their life wholly and with joy and abundance. I've seen that happen. So when we talk about people with mental illnesses who have really, they're unemployed, they may have substance use disorder, they're isolated, they're lonely, for these people then to be able to access a lethal injection over a medicine which is very safe and very effective does not make sense to me. So we should not, and as well as when we have people that are accessing medical assistance and dying because they lack access to the social determinants of health, I think this is morally wrong. And so I feel that people need to have access. They need to be given the choice about being able to access any psychedelics for the treatment for their depression or anxiety or mental suffering, because it has been shown to be effective.
Okay, just a few minutes to go here.
A lethal injection.
Right. With a few minutes to go here, let's just get a couple of practical questions on the record. Paul, what would it take to make this legal in Canada?
Well, I mean, of course, the government could choose to do the right thing. We have a court case before the court, and if we're successful...
Which court?
We're in federal court, and we're challenging the psilocybin regulations. And so if we're successful, three things are going to happen. There's going to be doctors' gatekeeper access. Healthcare professionals are going to be able to get legal access so they can be properly trained, which is about efficacy and safety for patients, as Dr. Masuda mentioned. And then finally, patients will have the choice of synthetic versus natural. But the beating heart of the case is doctor as gatekeeper. But to legalize across the board, the government just has to do the right thing.
Mark, can you imagine a scenario down the road where we have, for example, a college of psychedelic therapists who are part of the gatekeeping process to make sure this all works?
Absolutely, yes. And they should have access to a wide variety of psychedelics. They should have access to not only mushrooms, psilocybin, but LSD, mescaline, dimethyltryptamine, MEAI, MDMA, the list. They should have access to all psychedelics, because what we know is that different psychedelics are helpful for people in different contexts. There should be trained professionals providing the service that are accountable to a college, so that if they behave badly, they can be brought into a process that engages with discipline issues. These are incredibly powerful tools, and they're powerful tools that can be used skillfully, but partly because their power, they can also go wrong. So we have to be very careful in how we legalize these. I believe that psychedelics are on the track to becoming legalized. The challenge for our society is doing it well.
Let's finish off here with a quote from the New York Times. Sheldon, I'm at the bottom of the last page. Maybe you could bring this up. The question for many is how far and how fast the pendulum should swing. Even researchers who champion psychedelic-assisted therapy say the drive to commercialize the drugs, combined with a growing movement to liberalize existing prohibitions, could prove risky, especially for those with severe psychiatric disorders, and derail the field's slow, methodical return to mainstream acceptance. Paul, does that ring true for you?
I mean, it's not completely ridiculous, but I think we're also at a different moment in time in which we realize the drug war is a failure. There's a lot of people are having really positive experiences with this, and it's anecdotal evidence, but it's all kinds of terrific things that they're getting out of this. Adults should have the choice to make. It's not just a public health question, it's also a liberty question. And if adults want to use this for positive reasons, then they should be allowed to. Is everything going to be perfect? It won't, and nothing out there is perfect.
It took 150 years to legalize pot. How long do you think it'll take to get this legal?
I'd say the low-hanging fruit is a more open medical system. We probably will have that in the next 3 to 5 years, and I'd say 5 years after that. I'd say 10 years from today.
Interesting. Okay. My thanks to the three of you for helping us understand this issue so much better. Mark Hayden in Vancouver, British Columbia, Valerie Masuda in Dubai, UAE, and Paul Lewin here in our studio. Thanks so much to the three of you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
People taking psilocybin mushrooms report a range of effects from heightened senses all the way to hallucinations and even feeling like they're having a religious experience. What is actually going on in the brain during that time? And why do researchers see such changes as an opportunity? Let's ask. In London, UK, David Nutt, the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London. He's also chair of the Policy and Research Foundation Drug Science. In the Bronx, New York, Rachel Yehuda, director of the Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research and a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And in Baltimore, Maryland, Frederick Barrett, professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and associate director of the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Center. And it's great to welcome you three to our program tonight. Rachel, to you first. According to the New York Times, quote, after decades of demonization and criminalization, psychedelic drugs are on the cusp of entering mainstream psychiatry. That's them. I'd like your take on how you would characterize where we are right now in terms of the science of psychedelic-assisted therapy.
I think we're at a very important moment where mainstream psychiatry has become very interested in the potential for psychedelic medicines in psychiatry, but we're not there yet in terms of replacing the standard of care. The psychedelics are still not approved by the FDA. They're still scheduled in most places around the world. And we're just at the beginning of our understanding of how they work. So while it's really very promising and an exciting time to research these treatments, it's going to be a while, I think, before these treatments are broadly available in the context of mental health therapy.
Okay, Frederick, where would you say we are right now?
I have to agree. You know, the potential for psychedelic therapies to treat a growing number of medical indications is really exciting and fascinating, especially in the context of a world in which we haven't had any new breakthroughs in psychiatric therapies for decades. It's a place in which there's a lot of excitement for the potential of these compounds and their approaches to help people who are suffering from mood disorders, possibly substance use disorders. But we also have a very long way to go. There's, you know, on the order of many hundreds of individuals who have been treated in randomized controlled trials that have been peer reviewed and published in the past couple of decades. And we have a long way to go in terms of understanding what the limits of the indication spaces are, you know, what indications, what medical treatments will be effective and what won't, and what will be risky and what won't. We still have quite a few questions to answer in that area.
David, a little history here. There was, of course, a lot of research into therapeutic potentials of psychedelics back in the 60s and 70s. In Canada, in Saskatchewan, you could receive government-funded LSD therapy to treat alcoholism. Research into psychedelics, I gather, though, has really been reignited over the last few years in particular. Why do you suppose?
Well, because there are two reasons. The first is we can image the brain and understand that there are remarkable effects of these drugs in the brain. They work fundamentally differently from any other treatment or any other drug. And more than that, we can actually begin to utilize those brain effects to target interventions such as with depression. So that's the first reason. The second reason is there's been a reappraisal of the reason for the banning in the first place and the 50-year hiatus when there was very little research. And most experts have come to the conclusion that ban was not warranted. And so we're redressing a really big imbalance in terms of scientific discovery and innovation over the last 50 years. And as you intimated at the beginning, as Rachel said, you know, we haven't had any real innovation in those 50 years. The drugs we use today for depression or for anxiety or for addiction are pretty much the same drugs as we used in the 1950s. So psychedelics offer a real alternative.
Well, I want to tap into your experiences with this new option, although not so new, but the new excitement around this option, because you've all done research using psilocybin-assisted therapy. Can you give us, and Rachel, why don't you start us off again, give us a sense of just how effective it has proved to be in your experiences for a range of mental health issues that you and those who you study deal with?
We're currently conducting a trial with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and just starting one on psilocybin. So I can't give you the results of the trial with psilocybin, certainly not for what we're studying it for, which is PTSD and trauma. For MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, there's a growing body of evidence from the phase 2 and phase 3 trials that the effects of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy are terrific and better than what we have seen with other treatments to date. And we're finding in our studies, in our study that is taking place at the Bronx VA, that this can be quite a phenomenal game changer for some people.
Frederick Barrett, how about in your world?
Yes, thank you. We've now conducted a series of clinical trials in various patient populations at Johns Hopkins University. And, mirroring what Rachel said, some of these preliminary results are rather remarkable. In a study that we conducted, the first randomized controlled trial for the use of psilocybin to treat patients with major depressive disorder, we treated a small sample of individuals, 24 individuals in total. And of those individuals, over 50% were in remission from depression for at least a year after the administration of 2 doses of psilocybin. And over 70% of the individuals in that trial were showing a clinically significant response for at least a year after drug administration, which it means, clinically significant means at least a 50% reduction in depression severity from pretreatment baseline. So these, of course, are remarkable results. But again, we need to see whether these results will replicate and whether they can be shown in different contexts by different groups and in different institutions. Other studies that have been conducted at Johns Hopkins University have shown some similar remarkable preliminary results. One study conducted by my colleague Matthew Johnson demonstrated in 15 people being treated for tobacco use disorder that at 6 months post-treatment, over 80% of individuals in the study were biologically verified abstinent tobacco and combustible cigarettes, which is remarkable. The gold standard treatment, which is varenicline, you may expect maybe 30% people abstinent 6 months after initiating treatment. But again, these are early stage open label pilot studies that need to be replicated and validated in more rigorous and controlled settings. But the excitement is that we are seeing these effects and we should follow up on them. And there is reason to be, excited.
David Nutt, I gather you recently completed a study comparing psilocybin to a traditional antidepressant, an SSRI as they're called. What did you find in your work?
Well, we found that on almost all measures, psilocybin did better than escitalopram, and it was particularly better in terms of remission rates. This getting people from a state of depression into a state where they effectively have no depression. They get kind of cured. And we had at least twice, sometimes, depending on the scale we used, up to 4 times as many people in remission after just 2 psilocybin treatments in compared with the standard escitalopram treatment. So that was extremely promising and a lower side effect burden as well. So it was a win-win for the psilocybin.
Let me read this excerpt to you. This is somebody who goes by the name of Raymond Doctor, a YouTube user, describing what psilocybin-assisted therapy offered to him. Here's how he describes it. The way I describe it to people is this: after feeling cold, numb, and gray inside from dealing with years of stress, it felt nice to notice how the sun felt warm on my skin. That feeling had always been there, but it had been drowned out by all the negative thoughts over the years. Feeling and acknowledging that warmth on my skin reset my view on life. I began to notice and appreciate the beauty in life, and it felt like that gray cloud of stress and depression that had grown in my head slowly dispersed, revealing clear skies. Okay, let's figure this out here. Rachel Yehuda, what's actually going on in the brain to create that kind of experience?
Well, if you ask me, I would have to say that we don't exactly know yet. There's no question that when you give psilocybin or any psychedelic, the brain starts talking to itself in a way that it doesn't usually do at rest, and many neural connections are formed. But that being said, it's not clear how to interpret that, and that's why we have to continue doing the work. I mean, when I was growing up, there used to be a commercial showing an egg in a skillet with "This is your brain on drugs." We want to be very careful that the effects that we see with brain imaging studies aren't just another version of that. So while we know something is happening, we're still not quite sure what that something is. And it's very important that we make that point so that we can really increase funding and inquiry into this area. And if we tell you what is going on before we really know, then perhaps nobody will think it's important to do the work to find out. So I think we're at a place where we can just say something's happening here, and then we need to really figure out what that is.
I remember those ads well, and the shot of the egg hitting the frying pan and spattering all over the place was not a pleasant thought when considering this issue. But let's assume we've come some distance since then. Frederick Barrett, what would you add to what Rachel just said in terms of what's going on in the brain?
I completely agree that we need to bring caution to interpreting to the data that we do have at this moment, but I think we're more than just at the starting line. We've learned something, and if we take a broad view of what psychedelics may be doing overall, is at the end of the day, in plain language, I think psychedelics are giving us the capacity to change the way that we see ourselves, our lives, and ourselves and our lives in the world and in relationships. And if we work back from that, we can begin to kind of interpret some of the data that have been generated. Some recent data from animal studies suggests that psychedelics may increase plasticity in the brain. And consider having a piece of clay that you warm up in order to mold it into a different shape. And it may be the case, I'm not saying definitively, but I'm saying it may be the case that psychedelics increase plasticity in the brain. But that has to be also approached with some caution, because just because you can put the brain into a plastic state doesn't mean that it'll naturally end up in a better place when you're done. And I want to take this opportunity to emphasize the potential role of the psychotherapeutic component to psychedelic-assisted therapy. This is not just administering a compound to a patient. It's administering a compound to a patient after careful preparation and screening, and then during and in the context of careful monitoring by trained professionals and therapists who are able to help people navigate these experiences, and then a lot of follow-up aftercare and integration. And essentially, it's that packaging around the psilocybin administration that I believe is taking the potential neuroplastic state and then molding it into something that is more adaptive and is in a place of healing afterwards. And so if we can set neuroplasticity as a potential thing that's happening in the brain, then I think we can work from there to also consider the possibility that psychedelics during their acute drug effects are allowing for brain networks to kind of reconfigure in ways that they may not have configured before, and possibly change the weight with which certain brain networks dominate your thinking and other brain networks don't. And essentially, within that space, people may be able to recover from mood disorders that are sometimes characterized by over repetitive negative self-thoughts, substance use disorders that are sometimes characterized by negative repetitive behaviors, and other indications that have some similar mechanisms may be equally amenable to psychedelic therapy.
David Nutt, I'm going to ask you if you would explain for us a term that I hear used in relation to your work, that being the default mode network. What does that refer to?
That's a network in the brain which has been discovered by brain imaging, and it's the network in which you do your thinking about yourself. And it's called the default mode network because if you're doing nothing except sitting quietly and thinking, that's the dominant network. The problem is, in disorders like depression and addiction, the default mode network becomes over dominant and locks people into these thinking and behavioral processes which characterize those illnesses. And psychedelics completely fragment the default mode network during the duration of the trip. And I think that's one of the reasons why these drugs allow people to escape from depressive or addictive thinking for the period of the trip, because they cannot re-engage the network which has been locking them into the thinking. And then also you get the increased connectivity in the brain under the trip, and that allows people to think differently about their past and also plan differently for their future. And then, as Fred said, with psychotherapy and possibly neuroplasticity, those new thoughts can be laid down into better behavior and cognitive patterns.
Let me share a quote with you from a neuroscientist named Mendel Kaelin, who explains how psychedelics can help people. Sheldon, if you would, let's get board 3 up here. Think of the brain as a hill covered in snow, and thoughts as sleds gliding down that hill. As one sled after another goes down the hill, a small number of main trails will appear in the snow. And every time a new sled goes down, it will be drawn into pre-existing trails, almost like a magnet. In time, it becomes more and more difficult to glide down the hill on any other path or in a different direction. Think of psychedelics as temporarily flattening the snow. The deeply worn trails disappear, and suddenly the sled can go in other directions, exploring new landscapes and literally creating new pathways. Okay, Frederick Barrett, should we see these therapies as sort of helping people become unstuck from a pattern of dug-in thoughts, similar to the analogy we just heard about the sled in the snow?
It's a very vivid and heuristically useful way of thinking about this. I think it's very possible that psychedelics do help us become unstuck in our limited behavioral repertoires, our limited, kind of negative thought patterns, and essentially the kind of stuckedness is the overdominance of certain brain networks, as David mentioned. I think it's very possible that this is the way that psychedelics work.
David Nutt, anything to add on that?
Yes, I'm writing a paper at present, which with the title, "Is it the snow that deals with the ruts, or is it an earthquake that shakes everything flat?" I think it could be either. I don't quite know yet which it is, but definitely there are changes.
Either way, I like both of those analogies. Nice. Rachel Yehuda, let me get you back in here. Depression, anxiety, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, addiction, even anorexia, I gather, is being treated with psilocybin-assisted therapy. In your judgment, why do you think it lends itself to such a large range of mental health issues for treatment?
Well, I think the promise of this approach is that we're going back to some of the basics of psychiatry, which is to try to find out or go to the origins of what has led you to have some psychic disturbance. And I think the idea of being in an altered state puts you in a place where you can have some introspection, you can develop self-compassion, you can be in a place where you're more motivated to build a trusting relationship with your therapist, and you're just able to reconnect with the world in a different place. Now, all of these things are important regardless of what your diagnosis is. A diagnosis really, at the end of the day, is a set of symptoms that are clustered randomly in a certain way.
Frederick Barrett, I want to ask you about your Bible. I want to ask you about the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It creates separate categories for mental illnesses. Does this research point to the fact that there is a common understanding, a common underlying mechanism for a host of different mental health disorders?
It's certainly the case that many forms of psychotherapy, regardless of the specifics of that form of psychotherapy, share a common core of elements that kind of bind them all together, to the point that many types of psychotherapy at their core are not necessarily very different from each other. in that same way, I do believe that there is a reasonable argument that many psychiatric and psychological disorders share common underlying dimensions. And I think that may be why psychedelics, if they are effective in treating a wide range of disorders, may be effective in treating a wide range of disorders, because it's not specifically targeting depression necessarily, or substance use necessarily, or some other indication. But I believe we have preliminary evidence that a concept such as cognitive flexibility, or the capacity to be flexible in the way that you think about yourself, that could be a therapeutic target of psilocybin. That is also a process that is impaired in patients who are suffering from depression, patients who are suffering from substance use disorders and obsessive compulsive disorders, and the list goes on. So, there's a lot to think about here, and there are a lot of reasons why psychedelics may be targeting transdiagnostic processes.
David, I see you nodding in vigorous agreement with that. Anything to add?
Well, yes, I think when you talk to our patients, they say the same thing. They often use a computer analogy. They often say it's like, I defragged my hard drive, or I reformatted my hard drive, or I ran a virus cleanup. I can think more flexibly. I can think differently. I don't get locked into ruminations. And what I find really appealing is that both our work and also Fred's work shows that there is increased flexibility in the brain when you image the brain, which corresponds rather well to the descriptions our patients give us of how their thinking has become more fluid.
Rachel, I want to ask you about your use of these therapies to treat trauma. How can a psilocybin-assisted trip help someone heal from past trauma?
Yeah, so it's just, in theory, this would open a person up to a different perspective about what happened to them. And this is very important, because one of the reasons that people develop PTSD following trauma is that they get locked into a certain narrative, usually involving guilt or self-blame or any of those kinds of things that create this narrative of being bad or unworthy or deserving somehow to be in the state they're in. And if you can be in an altered state where you can experience a different message from yourself or from the universe about really just being in a different frame of mind, then you might be able to take steps towards your own recovery, because I agree that cognitive flexibility is key. It's certainly key when you talk about a trauma-related disorder. A lot of people walk around feeling that they're to blame for what happened to them, that they allowed interpersonal violence, or they made bad moral choices, or even in the context of accidents or terrorism, they didn't do the right thing. And what a psychedelic experience can do is give you a whole different way of looking at it. And that's why the effects are so rapid, because once you have an insight, no one takes that away from you. If the goal is simply to suppress symptoms, which can be done with antidepressants and the like, then the minute that you stop with those medications, the symptoms come back. No, this is a more permanent fix. This is a change in perspective that can allow you not to need to have those symptoms anymore. And that's why it's an exciting model. It's not just another drug. It's going back to a very early approach in psychiatry, when the idea was really that you have a psychic wound of some sort that needs to really be looked at a certain way. Psychoanalysis took a long time. This is kind of a modern version of really making a cognitive shift. The neuroscience needs to catch up to it, but there's no question of what people are clinically reporting. And what they're clinically reporting is that they feel transformed, and it behooves us to really try to understand what they mean for that. But it's also important to do more clinical trials so that we can get a sense of who is ideally suited. The person that thinks this is just another magic pill will probably not be able to make the same kind of gains than somebody who is using this experience to gain perspective.
Frederick, can I get you to build on that? What sorts of insights do you think people are able to gain by using these therapies?
You know, it's remarkable how idiosyncratic the insights are. you can never tell what a person is going to come out of one of these experiences reporting. And if you'll allow me, that's a little bit of the magic of this experience. But really, it's not magic. It's some form of being more flexible. It's some form of being able to remove sometimes the affective component from a piece of trauma that you've experienced, so that you can see it and work with it more objectively. Or sometimes it's confronting a challenge that you've had that you've been avoiding in your life. You know, there's no one outcome. There's no one path to the same outcome across patients. It's difficult to always completely capture, but it is in this frame of really getting to the core of what a person has experienced that's led them to where they are, and relieving them of that so they can continue on in a better place.
David Nutt, can I get your take on the insights possible with this kind of therapy?
Yes, and I'm going to give you a clinical example from one of our patients in a minute, but I want to say one thing first. There's a common misperception that taking psychedelics is fun, and that's why they work. In our hands, patients with depression, anorexia, OCD, the therapy is not fun. Rachel will tell you that the MDMA therapy is very much not fun. It's hard work. And that builds on what Fred was saying. People have to want to get help. They want to change. They have to work hard through the therapy. And here's an example of how it works. So one of our patients he was treatment resistant for quite a few years, depression. And in his trip, we only gave him one trip. He saw his father abusing him, and he had been repressing that memory for decades. And that was almost certainly the reason he was depressed. He was consuming so much mental energy, not re-engaging with that fact. And during the trip, he was able to say to his father, "That's it. Now I know, I know you did that. And I've got closure." And he came out of the trip and he told us that he'd done that. And he's been well now for the last 8 years.
Well, let me ask about the trip, because there have been some developments that take, quote unquote, the trip out of the work. And I wonder, okay, Rachel, why don't you weigh in on this? Do you need the trip for this to work?
Yes, this is about the trip. This is really about the trip. If not, it's just another antidepressant that's tickling some receptor. This is about having an experience that's facilitated by the psychedelic, but designed to really put you in an altered state of consciousness, so that you could see something that you can't otherwise see, or experience something that you can't otherwise experience. I think most people that want to take the trip out of psychedelics haven't used them, and might be slightly afraid of what that means, or might feel a loss of control. These drugs are not dangerous from a medical perspective. They can make you more vulnerable, and you definitely want to be in the right, what we call therapeutic container, with the right person to do the right kind of work. But in terms of the toxicity factor or things like that, we don't have to be afraid of psychedelics from that perspective. We always have to be afraid when drugs or anything make people feel more vulnerable and have to operate in highly ethical standards. But the solution isn't to take away the trip. The solution is to build in more of the capacity to hold somebody safely in the process and provide for them the support during and after, so that we don't have to be afraid of people who get opened up without properly being closed up again. But this is about the trip.
Frederick Barrett, let me give you the last word on this. Do we need the trip in order for this to be effective?
I've personally guided over 40 psilocybin sessions for various populations. And as an investigator and a co-investigator on a series of clinical trials, I've observed a number of people going through this process. And I frankly don't understand how most of these folks could get from point A to point B, being a therapeutic response, without having had this very personally relevant and personally meaningful experience within which they've gained psychological insights that become part of their healing story. I think that is the medicine. The trip is the medicine. The trip is the treatment in my mind. But I would love to be open to the possibility that those who are trying to remove the trip from the treatment could come up with something that is nominally therapeutic. I don't believe that non-psychedelic psychedelic drugs will be nearly as efficacious as drugs that have the trip. But there are also some populations for whom it might actually be psychologically challenging or dangerous to administer psychedelics, such as those with a personal or family history of psychosis, or those who suffer from bipolar disorder with mania. It may be that it's not as safe to administer these compounds to those people. So what do we do for them? If we had another alternative, it might not be as good as the trip with the trip treatment. But if we had something else to offer other than SSRIs or typical antidepressants, I still think we should pursue that. I just don't think it's going to do as good of a job.
Well, this has been a great trip with you three. So let me thank you from left to right on our TV screens. Frederick Barrett from Johns Hopkins, Rachel Yehuda, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, David Nutt, Imperial College London. It's been great having the three of you on TVO tonight. Thank you so much. And that is the agenda for Thursday, March 30th, 2023. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka finds out where things stand in Israel after unprecedented protests put the government back on its heels. And a note before we go, stay tuned right after this program to watch our latest TVO Today Live debate. The question, are social media undermining democracy? Our guests debated and our audience at the Kitchener Public Library voted. It's up next on TVO or available anytime at TVO.org and on any of our social or streaming platforms. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at TVO.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.